start, I do want to welcome everyone to our first meeting of 2021. By the way, just a note to remind everyone that this event is being recorded, and we hope to post it on our YouTube channel. And you'll be seeing some more about that in upcoming days. We have a YouTube channel set up, and we have a LinkedIn group. I hope if you're on LinkedIn, follow us there. Look for American Statistical Association Delaware Chapter. Let's see. I guess those are our two main channels, and we're also trying to communicate through the national website as well, and some of the communities that our officers are members of. So we're trying to get back up off the ground. Just let me rehash the history just for a minute. We had convened about 1 year and 2 months ago at in a room on the UD campus, and a lot of us were there hoping to revive the chapter after several years of dormancy. And we had talked through a lot of great, interesting plans, and then we suddenly got hit hard with this international pandemic. We managed to have one online event with Larry, and then we kind of floundered for several months, and I apologize for that. We're now trying to resume something like a normal schedule. I hope to have more events coming up in the fall, and I know we've got a lot of talented members who could give interesting talks on a diverse array of topics. One thing we'll have to do soon, by the way, and this is very important, is to have elections. It looks like the current slate of officers are a little bit past their expiration date. So if you have ideas, if you want to run for something, you can send, you can write to us. It looks like we've got all 4 of our current active officers here now, which is great. So I'm here as elected as vice president and now acting president. And Lulu Chung is our treasurer, and Palanyapa Krishnan is I'm sorry, Lulu is our secretary.
Yeah, thank you.
Baba Krishnan is our treasurer. And John Green, our speaker tonight, is a delegate to the National Council of Chapters. So some of those people may continue, or maybe not. Maybe you have some great ideas for things you'd like to do with the chapter. So the officers will be talking later on, not tonight, but some other night in the next couple of weeks, and figure out a way to organize elections. And we'll solicit your input, your nominations, and somehow put together an election, and then try to get this on a more or less regular basis. So now that we know how to do things, as Tom was saying, we know how to work online now. That's kind of default for everyone. So those are the main items of business. I can't think of anything else before we introduce the speaker. So let me just pause before I introduce tonight's speaker and ask the officers or anyone else if there's anything urgent we need to talk about with the membership before we get started. No? Okay, if not, then let's go and introduce our speaker. So the speakers tonight is one of our officers, John W. Green. So I will read you only a portion of his extensive biography, which would take up a considerable portion of our meeting, but it's very impressive how multi-talented he is and how many interests and accomplishments he has. So John has PhDs in statistics and mathematics, and taught both subjects at the University of Oklahoma, Texas A&M, and the University of Delaware for 21 years. Then he worked for DuPont, which of course, you know, later became Dow DuPont, and then Corteva for 30 years. And he now has a consulting business. That consulting business has a number of interesting clients who are governments actually around the world, major crop protection chemical companies, government agencies, non-government agencies, and nonprofits. John has worked specifically for 17 years with government agencies at home and abroad, including some that you'll recognize and others you won't. I'll just stick with the first group, the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And possibly you've heard of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. That's the group of the major industrialized countries. And these agencies need to develop statistical methods in many different test guidelines. John is an author or co-author of nearly 50 refereed scientific papers in mathematics and statistics. Also authoring a book very recently from Wiley in 2018 called Statistical Analysis of Ecotoxicity Data. And you can imagine how very important that is these days. He's also written chapters in 2 other books. One is the role of the study director in non-clinical studies, also from Wiley, and a chapter in a forthcoming book on honeybees, which is also somewhat in the news if you're looking at the so-called colony collapse disorder. Okay, I think without further ado, I want to announce the topic of the talk, which is controversies in ecological statistics, which should be very multifaceted and interesting. So I'm going to turn it over to John now, and we'll figure out a way to be able to share John's screen. So I think you can find that. Great. Great.
Okay, let's see, where are we? Okay, and you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Super. Okay, so I do want to bring up some areas that have some controversy associated with them in this field. And I think it would probably be a good idea, given the mixed background of people in attendance tonight, to talk a little bit about how things go on in the regulatory area in ecotox. And we're looking at chemicals that get into the environment in volume, such as crop protection chemicals, which would be an obvious one. And of course, that's what I worked on when I was in DuPont. Pharmaceuticals are also increasingly being covered under these same test guidelines, both because of manufacturing processes and improper disposal, such as people flushing their unused medicines down the toilet. And there are other chemicals that appear in volume in the environment, usually from manufacturing operations. So the basic design for many of our test guidelines is that we expose a series of plants or animals to different concentrations of a single chemical for a fixed period of time. Now, certainly there are more complex experiments than that, but that's the basic paradigm. And then we compare various physical and biological characteristics, which we statisticians call responses, of the exposed subjects, and compare those to a control population, which would be a concurrent treatment group, where we don't do anything to the plants or animals except put them in boxes or cages or tanks. And we do this for many different plant and animal species, and we test them under a variety of different conditions of exposure time, life stage, and so forth. And so for each species and set of conditions, the statistical evaluation is done to determine at what levels of the concentration or dosage of the chemical there is an adverse reaction. And then something I'm not going to cover in the talk, but we take all the results from all these different species evaluations and in some fashion or other combine them to come up with our overall risk assessment. I'm not going to get into that tonight. What I will do is talk about a very simple kind of design. We have a control population and one or more treatment groups exposed to this chemical. And the treatment groups are just different concentrations of that same chemical. Now, usually we have multiple vessels in each treatment group. This would be tanks if you're talking about fish or frogs, pots if you're talking about flowers or vegetables, cages if you're talking about birds or rats or mice, something like that. And there usually are multiple subjects in each one of these tanks. So you've got subjects, let's just say fish, nested in tanks, tanks nested in treatment groups. Now, with few exceptions, most of these test guidelines don't just analyze or don't just measure one response. You're measuring multiple responses on each subject, and that leads to some statistical problems. You find, for example, for some endpoints, some responses, there's very little variability, and the analysis finds very small changes in these responses to be statistically significant. For other responses, there's a lot of variability, and you only get very large responses that would be found statistically significant. So there are areas, that's one of the areas of controversy. I'm not going to get into that particularly, but that is one thing that one has to live with here. You know, you don't do an experiment with just one response, except at a very early stage where you're talking about mortality. At the very early stages, you're looking at what concentration will kill fish, and that's the only one you're looking at. It's a very simple experiment, but once you get past that very early stage, we do these so-called sublethal type experiments where you're not expecting to kill the animals or the plants, but you're expecting to have an effect on their size or their ability to reproduce and things like that. So I want to start off by talking about a kind of data that comes up in some of these studies, ordinal data. And there are two main ordinal responses that come up in some of these test guidelines. And that's developmental stage, where perhaps we expose a something like a tadpole, and we're going to observe it over time and see how rapidly it matures to metamorphosis, where it turns into a frog. And there are levels of maturity that are assessed based on certain physical changes in the frog or in the tadpole or whatever animal species we're looking at. And these will be numbered. Usually there may be only five developmental stages, or there might be as many as 17 in the study I looked at just recently. It depends on at what stage of life we start the study and at what stage of life we stop the study. But these developmental stages are just ordered categories. They're not quantitative. One stage, going from stage 5 to 6, for example, might take 1 day. Going from stage 6 to 7 might take 3 days. Going from stage 10 to 12 might take a week. I mean, there's no set time frame that separates one of these developmental stages from another. Another type of ordinal data is the histopathology severity score. Now here there are usually only 4 or maybe 5 levels. And so a histopathologist will look at tissue slides and make a judgment as to how severely affected that particular tissue is. And there are different issues that are involved in these different types of experiments. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But let me give you an example here of a histopathology tissue slide, or actually these are 4 different slides. And these slides on the right are indicating 4 levels of severity of effect. They all look the same to me, basically, but I look at the numbers. I judge. I go with the data that the histopathologist tells me. Grade the upper left-hand corner is a very minimal effect, and the lower right-hand corner is a very severe effect. And so I don't deal with that. I don't judge the slides. What I deal with are the scores. And so the question is, how do we analyze things like this? So for example, for histopathology, usually we have these categories, none, that is, there's no effect observed, no adverse effect observed in the slide, or there's minimal effect, mild, moderate, or severe. Now the distribution of these scores is not even. It may be, this is just an indication of what might happen. It might be that the slides that are judged moderately affected have much more variability and what that might represent than some of the other categories. So there's no idea of it's very difficult to compare these different things. Now, I think very few people would suggest that if half the tissue samples in a given replicate or given vessel were judged to have a minimal finding and half of them were judged to have a moderate finding, that on average the finding is mild. That really doesn't make much sense. But even though it doesn't make any sense, it's very common to label these scores with numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And because they're numbers, people say, well, let's take 1 and 3 and take the average, that's 2. Well, that's taking minimal and moderate and averaging it to come up with mild. It's total nonsense. But yet that has been done many different times in many different places, including by statisticians. And it's simply an improper way to analyze ordinal data. And I don't think I'm telling people in this room something they don't already know. Okay, so what are the statistical considerations in analyzing an ordinal type response? Well, it is ordinal, it's not quantitative. And we have an ordered explanatory variable, that'd be the test concentration or dosage. If we're talking about histopath, usually there's low incidence because we don't test every animal for these histopathology responses. It's very time consuming and expensive to do that. So we may wind up with only 3 or 4 observations in a given tank that we actually do the scoring on. And that leads us to uneven replication, both within tank and between tanks. And that's something that needs to be taken into account. And then there's the variability of the severity scores within a given vessel. That is, not all of the fish or plants or frogs in the given vessel are going to have the same severity scores on the tissue samples. So there's a lot of variability in there that should be taken into account. Now, some of the things that have been done with these kinds of data, well, the simplest thing is don't do anything statistically. And there's certainly, in the old school, a lot of biologists that prefer that. They don't want to have to consider the numbers. They say, I look at this frog and I can see if it's healthy or not, and you don't tell me anything about your statistics. Well, regulators don't usually accept that anymore. They used to, but they don't much anymore. The second, I've already mentioned, you treat the labels as though they were numbers and then do a t-test or a Dunnett test or some other statistic that's totally inappropriate for the data that we have. Or some people have done chi-square type tests, and that has some problems. You usually, to do a chi-square test, you have to ignore the replicate structure, the tanks. You just talk about the total number of fish and or frogs or whatever in the vessel. And it also ignores any kind of dose-response relationship. And in toxicology type studies, you expect as the test concentration increases, the effect is also going to increase. That is, you anticipate there being a monotone concentration response shape. There's certainly situations where that's not true, but that is the general expectation. Or you do a Mann-Whitney test, some other non-parametric tests, which again ignores concentration response shape, and it ignores the replicate size because you get one measurement, that say the median score from each replicate, and that's what you're analyzing. Or you do a John Keir test, which does the same thing. You're using one measurement off of each replicate. You do have that is based on monotone dose response relationship, but you're still ignoring replicate size and the variation of scores within the replicate. So there are a couple of newer methods that have been developed to handle this. One is using what's usually referred to as an index system, and this tends to be mathematically very complex, and it's quite easy to get lost in the forest. You can't see you can't see the trees for the forest. You can't see the forest for the trees, whichever way you want to say that. And we had a conference in 2018 in Europe where one of the leading histopathologists in the world was criticizing this index system and indicated that it just really was not useful. It was tended to be very misleading. The histopathologists couldn't understand the results, and the statisticians that used it couldn't understand the histopathology, and it was really a mess. And then there are two new methods that I had some hand in developing. One called the multi-quantile John Keir test, and I'm going to give you some examples of that in a little bit. Another one that's specifically for developmental stages, because the data there tends to be, you have several replicates per treatment group and lots of animals in each treatment group, up to 20 or so. For severity scores, where you have these smaller numbers, we developed another method, my colleague Tim Springer and I, which is called the Rouse-Scott-Cochran-Armitage by slices test, or just RSCABs. Now, a lot of people pick at that name, RSCABs, but I like it. And anyway, both of these methods have been adopted by the OECD for test guidelines, and I'm actually working with the Canadian government right now, looking at another application of these two tests. Amy Sonnier, which I know many of you in this group know, and I had developed a SAS-based software package called StatCharms. I take no credit for the name. That was a name designed by committee led by the EPA. So anyway, we're stuck with the name. Anyway, we developed a SAS-based package that did the RSCABs and a number of other things as well. And then we did that under contract with the EPA. And then EPA then contracted another fellow, Joe Swintick, a statistician, to take our SAS code and turn it into an R program, which has the same name, and that's now available in the CRAN library. And there are also programs in SAS and R for both of these tests available through that textbook. Okay, let me give you a little bit of visual image of what this multi-quantile John Keir test does. It's based on the idea of quantile regression, which is a very nice concept. We can't use quantile regression in this particular application, but the motivation is certainly there. And the idea is very simple. If we think of a distribution for the control, and I'm indicating like a normal type distribution, but it doesn't matter what the distribution is. And we then take a treatment group where the animals or plants are being exposed to some chemical. If the effect is to shift the distribution, up or down, but not change the shape of the distribution, then if we look at the change in, say, the 20th quantile of each of the distributions, that'd be the same change as the change in the 50th quantile or the 10th quantile or whatever. That is, you'd expect the same change in all the different quantiles. If you change the shape of the distribution, then all bets are off. But if all you're doing is shifting the distribution, then you'd expect the same change in all these different quantiles. And that leads to a very simple test, this multi-quantile John Keir test. I'm not going to describe the John Keir test, but the John Keir test, in basically, you take the median, the replicate, and each treatment group, the median developmental stage or severity score. And then you would do a trend test, the John Keir trend test on those medians. And that has been done with things like developmental stage. But when I worked with some of the biologists, they were not happy with the results of that test because we're ignoring all the variability in the replicate. We're just looking at the median. And so we came up with this idea, well, let's not just stick with the median. Let's look at the John Kerr test applied to the 20th quantiles and also to the 30th and the 40th and so forth. Now, given that you only have about 20 animals per treatment group, you can't do a more refined quantile regression than that. I mean, it wouldn't make any sense to talk about the first quantile because, you know, what is 1% of 20 animals? I mean, there's just no, it's just not a useful concept. So we stuck with the 20th through the 80th, and that could be more or less depending on the sample sizes. And here's an example where doing this, there was a statistically significant change in that median. So if you just did a simple John Kerr test, we'd say that the high treatment group was an effects level. And that's what I've got that arrow pointed to. There is a downward trend there in the median, but you don't see it in all the other quantiles. And so this test would say that no, there's nothing significant going on. There's no effect of this particular chemical under these conditions. And you contrast that with something like this, where all the quantiles are going, all the different trends are going in the same direction, and you can see a very clear downward trend in these data. And then, of course, there's a question, how do you combine all these things? And I'm not going to get into the technical details on that, but it's a very simple process. Now, what I'm not going to show you is the R-scabs. That's a more involved procedure, and we'd spend all evening just talking about that. But that handles the low incidence type severity scores quite well. And the histopathologists that we've worked with, very happy with that. So enough bragging on myself there. So let's talk about another kind of endpoint. So anyway, the controversy there is, do you do stupid statistics like treating the labels as though they're numbers, or do you do something that ignores the nature of the experiment, or do you do something that's very complex mathematically and may appeal to the mathematician in me, but loses the audience? It's hard to understand, interpret the results. Okay, so mortality and survival are very common responses, particularly for short-term studies, the so-called acute studies. In the simplest situation, like in a test guideline 203, which is a fish acute test, all we're doing is looking for the concentration that kills 50% of the exposed subjects. So we're estimating what's called an LD or LC50, lethal concentration for 50% of the subjects. Other studies were asked to do an LC10 or an LC20, that is a concentration that kills 10% or 20% of the subjects. Now, as they killed, I mean, we may be talking about planting seeds, and some number of them don't emerge. So I guess we're killing the seed in some sense, but they don't emerge. Or we could be talking about the tumor incidence. It doesn't have to be mortality, but it's the same kind of statistics. Or in other cases, one of the interesting things about fish, if you expose fish in the embryonic state to certain endocrine disrupting chemicals, you can actually change their phenotypic sex, so that a genetically male fish, for all intents and purposes, is a female fish, can lay eggs, there is a limit there. They only can have, a male turns into a female in that way, they can only have male offspring. So there are population implications when you change the phenotypic sex of the fish. And one interesting thing for statisticians is that some software can handle mortality quite well, but can't handle survival. And those are certainly equivalent concepts. If you know how many people die or how many animals die, you also know how many of them live, because you know how many were exposed. But some software has problems analyzing survival as opposed to mortality. And SAS ProcProbit is such a software package. There are other packages within SAS that handle it quite well, but not that one. And we'll talk about why in just a moment. So here's the classic shape of a mortality response. It's one of these nice sigmoid shaped curves that supposedly looks something like the distribution function for, say, a normal random variable. So we're looking at something like estimating an LD or LC50. And so on the vertical axis, we've got the proportion of mortality. And on the horizontal axis, we've got the concentrations of the chemical. And so to find the LD50, at least visually, you'd go over to the vertical axis and look at 0.5, that's 50%. Project that over to where it intersects the curve, and then project downward from that to the concentration, and that'd be at least the visual way to estimate the LD50. And by where it looks at, where it intersects the 95% confidence bounds, you could project down from there and get what we call fiducial limits on that LD50. That is some idea of the amount of error there is in the LD50 estimate. Okay, so the mortality model for a probit model, which is this typical thing we do in this field, or you could use log logistic, and everything I'm about to say applies equally to the log logistic model as it does to the probit model. The standard probit model looks like this. So y is equal to the standard normal distribution function phi as a function of a linear function of the log of concentration. For positive concentrations, and it's equal to 0 if at concentration 0. And while it may not be obvious, that is a nice continuous differentiable function at 0. Okay. Now, one of the issues here, and this is where the controversy comes in, is that it's not uncommon to have background mortality. That is, some plants, some seeds don't emerge, not because you did anything to them, they just didn't emerge. There's something inherent in the seed that it just doesn't come up. Or some fish die without, any human intervention, without any chemical cause. They just don't survive. And so there's what we call background mortality to deal with, or background incidence more generally. Now, when that happens, the probit model that I've just described is not accurate because it assumes 0 background mortality. Now, in 1925, so we're getting on close to 100 years ago now, a man named W.S. Abbott developed a simple formula to normalize mortality data so that you could use the standard probit model to analyze the data. And what he did, in effect, was instead of analyzing the actual mortality numbers, he instead analyzed the percent change from control. So, the simple formula, if you take the normalized percent, you get that by subtracting the observed percent mortality from the control mortality and then dividing that by the control mortality. And so you're going to start off with 0 change from the control because you subtracted, P0 from P0 and then divided by P0, you're going to get 1. You're going to get 0, excuse me, not 1. And that's what's called Abbott's formula, or at least it leads to what's Abbott's formula. And that's something that's been used ever since 1925. It appears in one test guideline I'm aware of, OECD test guideline, and I have been trying for some years to get them to change that because this is a really bad thing to do. And there are 2 reasons for that, at least. One is that even though this formula is very simple, that P0 that is being subtracted and then dividing is itself a random variable. So what you've now done is create correlations where they didn't exist before. So instead of having independent observations, which we had to begin with, you now got all your observations are correlated. And that violates one of the basic requirements of most statistical models, which assumes that the observations are independent. Now, if that was the only thing that mattered, if that's the only thing that changed, then you might say, well, okay, that's a mathematical issue, but it really doesn't affect anything. Well, in fact, it affects quite a bit, or can. Before I talk about what kind of change it might have, let me point out that it's actually very easy to include background mortality in your model, and then estimate that as that's one of your added parameters. Now you're going to have a background incidence rate C, and all you've done is take that standard probit formula, that's that phi of A plus B log concentration. It's the same thing we had a moment ago, but now I have multiplied that by 1 minus C and then added C to it, and there's no problem. There's no need to do any kind of adjusting. You just analyze the data as it comes in. And you can, if you wish, and it's a good thing to do pragmatically, is you can actually reparameterize it to make ECX one of your model parameters, but that's just to make things easy when you get it done. Okay, so he introduced this form in 1925 when you didn't have computers. Everything had to be done by hand, and so this actually simplified calculations. But we have computers now, we have software, and there's absolutely no need to use the Abbott's formula anymore. And I have been trying for some years to get the ecotox community to stop doing it, and we're making some progress. One of the advocates of this told me the last time I saw him, last time we had an in-person meeting, that he was no longer doing this based on the different presentations I had been making. Okay, but now my claim is it isn't just theoretically wrong, it is that it gives you bad estimates. And here's an example. This is data from a non-target terrestrial plant study, where we did experiments on a number of different crops. Here is pea, cucumber, onion, and sugar beet. And I calculated the EC10, EC25, and in a couple of cases, EC50, using a correct probit model, the one that I just showed you a moment ago, and also did that using using Abbott's formula. And as you can see here, in some cases, several cases I've got highlighted there in red, using Abbott's formula, you overestimate the LC10 by a factor of 2.6. In other cases, a factor of 2.8. In a few cases, you actually get the same answer. You get the right answer, but it's a crapshoot. You know, you don't know when you're going to get one or the other. Now, for risk assessment, this is fairly concerning, because this would say, for example, for a cucumber, that you could say a chemical is safe at level 389 parts per million or whatever this is, when in fact it's not safe all the way down to 149 parts per million. So put it in terms of human use, it's saying, you know, looking at one of these nice chemicals we spray on apples, this might say it's safe to eat 3 apples a day, where in fact it's only safe to eat 2 apples a day. Now, I'm not saying anything about apples here. That's just a simple-minded example to illustrate how these numbers affect risk assessment. You know, if you overestimate your LC50 or LC10, that can have serious implications for safety in the environment. And they also can work the other way, where the normalized value can come out giving you a low number that is just much lower than it should be. And so you're penalizing a good chemical by misanalyzing how dangerous it is. So Abbott's formula has also been applied to continuous endpoints. And this is, first it happened at Haskell Laboratory when I first started working at DuPont. And I thought it was a local issue, and I got them to stop doing it. But I found out some years later that this was being done all across the world. And the problem is that you got people that don't know statistics, and you got people that have only a limited software. It can fit a probit model, and that's all it can do. So they force fit all of their data into a probit model. So it's a classic example of, you know, trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole. You only got one device, and so you're going to make all your data fit that device, and that's not a really scientific sound thing to do, and there's no longer any reason to do that. So we're making some progress, but we still got a long ways to go. Okay, another major area of controversy, in fact, it's getting less controversial over time because I think the judgment's been made by and large, but that is the role of hypothesis testing versus regression in doing risk assessment. And I know that people here understand what hypothesis testing is, but let's introduce some notation. In this context, we are going to test the effects at different test concentrations with the goal of determining the lowest tested concentration at which there is a statistically significant effect on the response. And that is what is abbreviated as a low-EC. And then the highest test concentration below the low-EC is the no-EC, the so-called no observed effects concentration. And for many, many years, this is how we did risk assessment. You calculated the no-EC and the low-EC, and then you based your risk assessment on a given chemical on those two numbers. Or sometimes you take a geometric mean of those to come up with so-called MATC, but that's another matter altogether. Okay, there are some issues with the NOEC, and these have been aired out quite thoroughly in the statistical and ecotox literature. We don't know in advance what size effect exists at the NOEC that is not built into the test. Anything about the size effect, it's just whether it's significant or not, statistically significant or not. And so for some endpoints, some responses, such as Daphnia magna link, that's a water spider, You can get significant effects, which really amount to only a 1 or 2% change in the length of one of these little water spiders, and it's not clear that that has any biological meaning. At the other end, you might have something like vitellogenin, VTG, in fish, and it may take a 40% change or even higher before it would be statistically significant. And so the concern there is you may be missing some real effects because of the low power of some of the tests that are used. Which brings up the second thing, what test do you use? There's a lot of people that in this field that use Dunnett's test, which is a multiple comparison test. You compare treatments to the control, ignoring any information about how the treatments compare to each other or about any dose response shape. And there are better tests than that. And then there's a question about what power should you have. For many years in developing test guidelines, people didn't care about the false negative rate. They were concerned about the false positive rate. But actually both are important. You don't want to say a chemical is safe if it isn't. You don't want to say that it's unsafe if it is. And so you should pay attention to both the false positive and the false negative rate. But then that's tied back to this issue about what size effect you want to be able to detect. And it is quite difficult to get toxicologists, biologists to agree on what size effect it's important to detect. I tried for years at Haskell to get some agreement on that, and they would absolutely not provide that information to me. They couldn't tell, they didn't know. So that's a very challenging issue. Okay, next question is, can we assess the uncertainty in the NOAC? And the answer is no, we can't. There's no way, there's no confidence interval you can place around the NOAC. It's either there's a significant effect at a given test concentration or there's not. There's no uncertainty in what that NOAC might be. Now you can talk about the uncertainty in the response at that concentration, because you got a mean response, you can put a confidence interval on that, but that's not a confidence interval on the NOAC itself. And then people say, well, in theory, any positive size effect can be found statistically significant if the experimental design is big enough. Well, that's certainly true, but it's really irrelevant. If you're doing a guideline study for risk assessment purposes, the guideline tells you how to run your test, how many replicates, how many subjects, and so forth. And we design those tests so you have 80% power to detect effects that the people on the team agree is important to detect. So that's not a real issue as far as risk assessment is concerned. And there have been attempts to ban the use of NOAC, which I think is terribly misguided, and we'll say a little bit more about that as we go on. Sometimes you want to argue that regression is so much better than hypothesis testing that you shouldn't use hypothesis testing. And if you don't believe me, then I'm gonna force you to do it my way, because if I can't win over the argument on scientific grounds, I'm gonna legalize it and make you do it that way. Well, so let's talk about regression. And so here we're fitting a regression model to one of these nice dose response type experiments. And the idea then is that we want to estimate the concentration at which an X% effect occurs. X could be 10, 25, whatever. And one of the advantages of regression over hypothesis testing is that ECX can be any concentration, not just one that was tested in the particular experiment. Now remember, the LOAC and NOAC are actually concentrations in the experiment as it was run. There's no interpolation between adjacent concentrations, but in regression, interpolation is a quite straightforward thing to do. And there's no doubt at all that if you can calculate an ECX, that provides more information than the NOAC. But you can't always do that, which is why there's a problem here. You come back to the same issue, for what X do you estimate ECX? Well, the European Union has answered that question for us. They said, you shall estimate an EC10. So the scientists couldn't agree on what X should be. So the legislators said, yep, it's going to be 10. And of course, that creates another set of problems, because 10% change is not always a good thing to measure. 10% change in vitellogenin doesn't mean anything. 10% change in the length of a little water spider, you've probably killed a spider before it has a 10% change in the length. So 10 is not a magic number except to the EU, but that's one of the issues that we have to deal with. But leaving that aside for a moment, even if we decide, okay, we're going to estimate an EC10, whether we think that's scientifically the right thing to do or not, can you actually estimate it? Well, that is, is there always a meaningful regression model that you can fit? And then that, of course, begs the question: what is a meaningful regression model or a meaningful estimate of ECX? Well, one way to answer that, or at least a partial answer, is, well, does the model fitting algorithm converge? If it doesn't converge, then of course that model is not doing you any good. So that's kind of basic. But beyond that, is the model stable? If you took one observation away from your data set, would that make a big change in the result? If it does, then that would be an indication of an unstable model. Another way is you look at the model parameters. If some of those model parameters are indistinguishable from zero, that's another indication you got an over-parameterized model, which I would call an unstable model. You can certainly plot the data with the model and give a visual assessment, and I think that's very valuable, but that's not a substitute for a more formal type of analysis. And then you come down to this issue, well, okay, it's ECX, that's the one we're really concerned about. So let's look at the confidence interval for it. And I would reject an ECX estimate if the confidence interval for it is too wide. And of course, that begs the question, what is too wide? And we had a big debate in OECD about that, because I was trying to promote criteria for deciding when the confidence interval was too wide to accept an ECX. And we could all agree that if the confidence interval for ECX spanned the entire range of tested concentrations, including zero, that it was too wide. And that's all we could agree on. And I found that disappointing, but okay, that's it. Okay, we asked another question then, look at it a different way. What if you fit a different model to the data and you got an estimate of ECX from that model? And it's not the same. It may be close in some sense, it may be far apart. How do you decide which one of those models is better? We need some kind of criteria to pick the best model. Well, actually, we need some criteria to pick models to start with. I mean, which models do you even consider? I mean, there are infinitely many models you could try to fit. Some representative collection of models would be, I think, worthy. And there's a lot of work that's been done on that. Let me give you a couple of simple examples just to illustrate what's going on here. So here's one that comes from what's called a fish early life stage study, and we're looking at the total length of the fish. And here are the actual numbers over on the left, and you'll see that there's not much change going on. You get a 11% change in the high test concentration and a little bouncing around below that, but it's it's a fairly shallow, but it's a steady decrease. And here's my model. I fit what's called a Bruce Fiersteig model, not that that's particularly relevant tonight. And we're doing a reasonable job of estimating these observed percent changes from control, particularly as we get close to these too high test concentrations. Not so much up here because there's a lot of bouncing around in the data. And here's my EC10 estimate. Here it is, X equal 10. The estimate is 1,081 parts per million, which puts it somewhere between the two highest tested concentrations, and that's at least seems reasonable looking at the data. We had a 9% effect at 644, 11% effect at 1560, and this puts it somewhere in between those, which it looks like that's consistent at least with the data. And the confidence interval for that EC10 estimate spans two of the test concentrations. It goes from 420 to 2770. And so that spans the two highest test concentrations. That's not too wide given the nature of the data. If you want to try to estimate an EC5, the point estimate is probably not terribly unreasonable, but look, you got a 5% change here, then a 4% change, then an 8% change. And where does that 5% change really fall? The confidence interval for it runs from 29.5 to 622, and you'll see that spans four test concentrations, and I would call that too wide. Again, that wasn't something I could get OECD to agree to, but at least it's there's a qualitative difference between the quality of EC5 estimate and the EC10 estimate for these data. I don't think data like this really support estimating something as small as an EC5. Now here's another example, a much worse example. This is for telegenin. And look at the numbers on the left. You know, in the controls, we're getting numbers like 40 and 76, and even in the lowest 4 test concentrations, the numbers are pretty steady. I mean, there's not much going on in these data until you get above 24 parts per million. After that, it just explodes. So you've gone to, you know, 100 or less, you know, and the lowest test concentrations up to 3,979,000 in the highest test concentration. So it's you're talking about orders of magnitude effect on this endpoint. Fitting a regression model to numbers like this is going to be challenging. In fact, I couldn't find any model that would model these numbers at all. I could do it using logarithm transform, and there we don't see orders of magnitude, it just goes from 4 to 15. And I might say before I got off into the regression side of things that I think in this case, the NOAC, which turned out to be 24, says about as much about toxicity on this endpoint as you're going to get out of these data. Clearly something is happening above 24 parts per million, and looks very clear that nothing is happening below that. So calling a NOAC of 24, I think, is quite reasonable. It's informative. Fitting a regression model even to the log data turned out to be quite complicated. I really spent a lot of time trying to find some model that would fit these data, and I had a lot of trouble. I did finally find one, the so-called Nicholas-Minton model, but I was only ever able to estimate an EC 250. Estimating an EC 10 for data like this is absurd. And keep in mind, that's on the log scale. So this actually corresponds to a 12,000% change from control on the raw scale. So I think regression is not doing anything for us with data like this, but the NOAC, I think, is quite reasonable. Okay, now another issue that's come up because of this EU legislation, we've got chemicals that have been out there for decades. And so the EU said, okay, we want you to go back and reanalyze all those old studies and that were done for NOAC, LOAC, and now I want you to estimate EC10 because that's the law. Now, one way around that is, okay, do another experiment, but these experiments aren't cheap. Well, these avian reproduction studies, you're going to spend, you know, $250,000 or more, and you're killing a lot of birds, and you got the animal rights people saying, no, 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 don't do that. So we're being forced to go back and analyze all these old data sets and estimate an EC10. But these studies weren't done for regression. They were done for a NOAC. You only have 3 treatment groups and a control. And so there's a very limited number of regression models you can even attempt with data like that. And what happens is that you have a hard time fitting a regression model one of these endpoints. Here's an example where I fit 4 different models, and we don't need to worry about what the models mean. These are just 4 different models. BVP, that's the Bruce Furstick, and a couple of exponential models. And here's the variety of EC10 estimates. They range from 24.7 to almost 500. That's quite a range given the test concentrations. The test concentrations were 050, 250, and 1250. And so to say the EC10 is somewhere between 25 and 500 is not saying very much. So we need some criteria for deciding which, if any, of these models is actually describing the data. To make matters even worse, some of the regulations call for doing risk assessment based not on the point estimates of EC10, but on the lower confidence bounds. Doing a risk assessment based on these lower numbers, the best one is 0, and the others are, you know, minus numbers. And so you're saying that, you know, you might have a 10% effect before you ever do anything to these chemicals. I mean, to these plants or these birds, I guess, in this case. That's total nonsense. You can't use the lower confidence bounds from these models to do any kind of risk assessment. And in fact, I'd be pretty reluctant to use any of these models, even for the point estimates, at least based on what I'm showing you at the moment. And here are the actual data, and here's a curve that's fit. Let's see if I can't hide this. There we go. See, it's a very shallow concentration response curve there, and it's not surprising that there's going to be difficulty estimating something like a 10% effects concentration. So we have a real problem there. Now, the EU did put in some language that says, okay, you estimate an EC10 or an LC10 unless you can demonstrate that that it's impossible to estimate it. Well, that's nice of them to say, but how do you demonstrate that it is not possible to estimate an EC10? They don't give much guidance on that. Now, does that mean that I personally couldn't find a model that estimated EC10 well, or does it mean somebody else could, or surely it means more than that? And there is some guidance that's being developed on what that means to say that you cannot fit a regression model, but that's there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that. Others would say things like, well, your problem, going back to this curve, if you're too far, is that you should have extended the concentration range out to a higher level so you could actually pick up the curve. And that sounds nice, but how are these experiments run? Let's think about what goes on in a laboratory. Here's a piece of equipment that's used in certain aquatic studies. This little piece of equipment in the picture there costs $500,000, and it can handle 5 test concentrations and 4 replica tanks per concentration, and that's all it can handle. So if you tell me I've got to run 8 test concentrations, I'm going to have to build a $2 million machine. And, you know, somebody's got to pay for it, and the people that are asking for this aren't going to be the ones that pay for it. It's going to be a company. And maybe that wouldn't do it anyway, because here's an example where we had 12 test concentrations and there's still nothing going on. I mean, not all chemicals are bad. Here's one that just didn't have any effect on this particular response. It wasn't a matter of not having enough test concentrations, just that there wasn't anything happening. This chemical wasn't doing damage, in this case to oats. Okay, here's another indication where regression doesn't always do it for you. This is a typical response, or a standard response, in what are called Daphnia reproduction study. And here we're looking at the first day of reproduction. And what we have here is 7 Daphnia exposed to each of the different test concentrations. And this particular design, there's only 1 Daphnid per beaker. These are little tiny critters, so you don't have a whole tank, you just have a little beaker. And so each one of these boxes represents the first day of reproduction for the Daphnid in one of those beakers. Now, you don't see 7 boxes in each one of these test concentrations, because what happens is that you had the same first day of reproduction for many different replicates. And what we found is that there's nothing going on until you get to the high test concentration, 0.05 in this case. And what I've done here, I use this red line to connect the mean first day of reproduction in each treatment group. And you see it's very flat, except for a little bump there at the beginning, until you get to the second highest test concentration. And then it jumps up. There's clearly something going on at the high test concentration. Nobody's going to deny that. There's a delay in reproduction there. But the NOAC is going to be that second highest test concentration. There's no ambiguity about that. But if I wanted to estimate an EC10, I've got to fit a curve. And I've indicated, you know, at least 3 different curves that you might get: the gray, the green, and the blue. You saw my screen. You're going to get very different values for EC10 based on which one of those curves you might fit. And there's no biological or a priori reason for picking one curve over another. And so I think regression is not helping us there. Now, all this is not to say regression is a bad thing to do. It's a wonderful thing to do. It's just to say that it's problematic, and you can't always fit a useful regression model of some of these responses. And that brings us to the topic of doing multiple regressions, and then instead of picking the best model, do what's called model averaging. This is something that's becoming increasingly important in this in the area of ecotox. Now, there are lots of different ways to do model averaging, and we're not coming up with an average model. Let me make that clear. We're coming up with a way of getting an average estimate of EC10 and its confidence intervals. And there's a very simple way to do that. Maybe too simple, but there's a simple way to do that. And what's done is use this so-called Ecological information criteria. And there's a simple formula, and there are different ways to write it, but here's one way based on the residual sum of squares and the number of observations N and the number of treatment groups K. So you get this very simple formula. And you can compare two models for goodness of fit to the data by comparing their AIC values. And I won't go into why 10 is important here, but if two models have AIC values that differ by 10 or more, then the one with the smaller value is the better fitting model by this criterion. Okay, and here again, like everything else in life, is that it isn't that simple. Here are two models that are fit to the same data set. On the left is a decreasing model. And you'll see, though, at the three treatment groups that the treatment means are all about the same. In fact, they're almost identical. So there's not really a decreasing dose response. There's a decrease from the control to the low treatment group, but there's nothing going on after that. And so what really describes the data better is this so-called hockey stick model that I've got over on the right. But the AIC value for the hockey stick model is higher than that for the decreasing model. And the difference is less than 10, by the way, but this criteria is not doing a really good job of picking the better model, in my opinion. Okay, but how would you use this criteria in this model averaging? So there's a very simple idea here, and don't want to get bogged down into the very simple mathematics here, but you calculate a weight to assign to each model based on how far the AIC is for that model from the lowest AIC on all the models that you have chosen. There are other ways to go at that, but let's keep it simple for this discussion. And then once you've assigned these weights, then you calculate this average ECX value by simply looking at a weighted average of the ECXs from the different models. And you could also get the average lower confidence bound in the same way, though there are also more sophisticated ways to do that, and there's some controversy. There hasn't been a good decision made yet as to the best way to get the ECX lower bound average. So EPA published a working paper a few years ago on, they had about 8 or 9 different ways you might calculate that lower bound average, but there's no consensus yet, at least within EPA. Let me give you one example of how this works, and I think we'll probably wrap it up here. Here's an example where we have what's called hormesis, where at low test concentrations, there's an apparent beneficial effect. There's a rise in the mean response. And then at higher test concentrations, there's a decrease. So there's an adverse effect. And on the right, I have fit a decreasing model to the same data set. So I have ignored the hormesis and fit a model anyway. And so here's an example where I have fit the hormetic model and also fit, I think, 7 different monotone decreasing models and come up with the different EC10 estimates. Now you'll see that with 2 exceptions, all these EC10s are in the range from around 7 up to close to 10, or at least a little over 9. And so if we did science by vote, you'd probably say, okay, the EC10 should be somewhere around 7 or 8. You had 2 that came out with higher numbers. The hormetic model that I just showed you gave a value of 18. And another model, this a simple exponential model, gave a value somewhat close to that. If we do the model averaging, we calculate these weights, and what happens is that almost all the weight goes to the hormetic model in this particular example. So 97.5% of the weight goes to the hormetic model, and the rest of them have just negligible effects. And so your average EC10 estimate comes out basically just to be the hormetic model. And that's very useful when you're dealing with a risk assessor in one of the regulatory agencies. I got into an argument with one I guess about a year ago, where the reviewer said there's no hormesis in these data, so you shouldn't be fitting a hormetic model. But it was there clearly was hormesis in it. And I was showing him why the model that I was fitting fit better than any of the other models that he was suggesting. But he wasn't buying it. And I think something like this, I wasn't using model averaging at that time. That's one of the things that prompted me to investigate it. I think it makes a fairly powerful argument. Okay, I'll use your model. I'll use all these other models, and then we'll use this objective criteria for picking out the best way to estimate the ECX. And I think that's quite a useful thing to do. And that is becoming more widely accepted within the ecotox community, but we're still at the fairly early stages on that. And there are lots of issues here about how best to do the weighting, and I won't get into all that, but there are lots of areas of remaining uncertainty or controversy that can be applied here. Now, I've got another topic, but I think in the interest of time, I will stop. In fact, I don't have another topic. I just went through it all. Okay. All right. So in summary, these examples are a sample of areas of controversy, or at least change. Science is always evolving, and new methods are being devised, and some of them should be adapted, not all of them. Adopted, I guess it is. There is debate on property methodology, and that's healthy. I certainly don't expect everybody to agree with me, and I don't expect to agree with everybody else either. It's just a matter of how science evolves. You have an idea, you put it out there, and people beat on it and try it, and sometimes they come back and say, yeah, it's a great idea, but you need to do this. And sometimes they say, no, you're full of it, and there's a better way to do it. That's fine. That's the way it should be. In any case, I think this is a very fun process, and there's lots of room for excitement. Now, I've talked a lot. I've talked fast, I'm afraid, but for any questions, I'll be happy to address them.
Thank you very much, John. I guess, yes, indeed. So let's thank the speaker. I guess during the presentation, you may not have noticed, and I've seen this giving Zoom presentations myself, but several items showed up in the chat on the side.
I didn't see
Tom
it.
has had his hand up, is probably drained of blood by now. But
okay,
yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Interesting enough, I got pulled away to dispose of a spider by my wife and 9-year-old. So I guess it had some relevance to the talk. That was fully toxic.
All right.
John, I was wondering, at the very beginning, how many species are tested? Just to get a sense, is it and that meant to be canaries in the coal mine, not in the calming. Are there some that are indicators, or, are you doing it for 5, 10, 20 different things, or?
Well, it's probably closer to the hundreds. There are some standard species. Any risk assessment includes 3 varieties of fish, at least. You have both marine species and freshwater species. You've got a number of different plants. You've got algae, aquatic plants. You've got terrestrial plants like tomato and cucumber, and you've got wild plants. You've got fish. You've got birds. Avian studies is a big one. We do earthworms. We do a huge variety of aquatic animals, as well as aquatic plants, terrestrial plants. We do rats and mice frequently. In rare cases, you might do some other species like a guinea pig or something like that. It's a huge variety of species that are exposed. We don't test people usually. We have actually done a couple of human trials where we had volunteers take doses of pesticide to see what would happen to them. But that's unusual. That's very unusual, but it does happen. And we actually banned one of our chemicals for use on strawberries because we tested it on children, among other people. We rephrased this. We didn't test it on children, but we collected data from people that ate strawberries that had been exposed to our chemical, and we came up with a conclusion that this product was quite safe for children under 6 who ate less than 2 pounds of strawberries a day. Well, it turns out there are children that eat more than 2 pounds of strawberries every day. I found that surprising, but we found that to be the case, and so we stopped using the chemical on strawberries. But that's unusual. Usually we find that out by testing it on these other species, and then there's all this, well, how do you extrapolate the risk to a mouse or a rat to a human? And there's a lot of controversy about how best to do that. But yes, there's many different species, and do it under different stages. I mean, life stages. Like you do these simple experiments where you expose fish to a very high level of the chemical, and if nothing happens at that very high level, you may think you don't need to do much more testing on that species. But if it does happen, if you do find an effect at a high level, then you do a whole battery of tests to find out, well, exactly at what level do you see an effect, and what kind of effect do you see. These studies go on for several years, in order to get a chemical actually approved for use in the environment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like one of the last stage of studies we'll do would be a 2-year rat study or 2-year mouse study, which by its name, it lasts 2 years. And that's after you've done all this other testing.
Thank you.
Let's see, just running down the chat on the side. So my question, it was just kind of a technical question motivated, from the mathematics side. Concentration is a continuous variable, so doesn't the NOAC equal the LOAC?
Well, no, because you're looking at it on a study by study basis, and so in a given experiment, you've got 5 test concentrations, and they do have some distance between them, and so you're not doing interpolation, and that is one of the advantages of doing the regression modeling. So you're not held to the particular concentrations in a given study. You do the interpolation, from a regression model.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in theory, yes, NOAC or LOAC could be anything, but they didn't how they're done. You're done on an experiment by experiment basis,
right?
And even by endpoint by endpoint, because on a given experiment with 5 different responses, you might have 5 different NOACs, one for each response, and then you'd be judged on the lowest one of those.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good, thank you. Now Lulu has a comment here. How did you estimate the weights for the model averaging method? If 2 models were similar, will that impact the convergence of the estimation?
Well, the formula that I gave, this based on the key information criteria, that comes up with weights. The weight for a given, well, here there are two issues here. The simplest approach, you take say you fit 5 or 6 or 7 models. One of those is going to have the lowest AIC value of those models that you have fit, and you're going to compare all the other models to that one. And you'll use that AIC formula to calculate a weight. So it's a relative weight. It's relative to the lowest observed AIC among the models that you selected. So for a given set of models, there's a very simple process for coming up with these weights. Now, the really interesting questions are, well, what model should go into this set of models that you use? And there is no universal agreement on what that set of models should be, although we do tend to coalesce around certain kinds of models. I mean, there have been papers published about, which models are the right candidate models to fit to one of these kinds of experiments. That's not to say everybody agrees, but there are about 7 models that I routinely use, and I didn't invent any of those models. I mean, they are models that have been in the literature, and I think there is not a lot of controversy about using those models, but you can always find models, data sets where none of those models fit, and you have to find, fit something else. And so I actually got into a little bit of an argument with the authors of a paper I was the referee on, and you know, I challenged them about their model selection process. And they said, well, everybody understands this. I said, well, no, not everybody does. I'm sorry, but you know, I want to know what criteria you're using. And one of the things he was saying is, or they were saying, I should say, wasn't a he necessarily, because it was a double blind kind of thing, was that we should only have one representative model from a class of similar models. And so I said, what do you mean by similar? He said, that's a well understood concept. I said, no, it isn't. I don't know what it means. What makes two models similar, and in what sense are you using that term? And he wouldn't give me an answer. So that's getting off a little bit on a tangent, but there is certainly room for controversy. Now, in some kinds of situations, you actually can have a most sensitive model. I mean, it's not very informative, but most sensitive, that is, you basically just fit a stair-step model to the data. You know, it just goes through every mean, and you can get an AIC for that, and then you can compare all your other models, you know, to the AIC for that one. And that's, in some sense, a more objective way to do it. But again, it's very data dependent. I mean, it's based on the, you know, the best, you know, the mean responses in a given study, rather than on any kind of mathematical or biological model building process. So there's definitely room for uncertainty there.
And Larry has his hand up. Can you, Larry?
Yeah, having given a presentation about the limitations of binary regression, and my first thought was, I think those outcome variables are collapsed categories of continuous measures. Am I right about that?
Some cases, certainly they are. I mean, you're talking about mortality. I mean, you know, animals either
Right.
dead or alive. There's not much room for ambiguity there, except in Hollywood. But for other things like first day reproduction, you know, for example, that's a good example of what you're talking about. It's really time to first reproduction that we care about. It's just we measure it on such a crude scale. You know, they observe, you know, each day whether reproduction has taken place, but that's a 24-hour span, and so, you know, it's a surrogate for the time to first reproduction. So, and that's a very good example, I think, of what you're saying, that it's, you know, it's a crude measure of what's really on a continuous scale.
Yeah, that's, well, one of my conclusions was that whenever you have continuous data, unless there's an overwhelming reason, that you don't categorize it and run a logistic regression or some other quantitative or quantal regression method. The other question I had is on these models with the Q stick or the hockey stick at the pivot point, it seemed to me like you could run a linear, well, not linear regression, but a least squares regression by putting in a dummy variable at that point. That you could figure out where that point was by doing some graphics. And then if run that as a regression model, you might need some square terms in there. And you might need a product between the dummy variable and the concentration. But then that could, how well that works, I mean, in one experiment, of course, you've got a lot of sampling error, but it should then be tested against other experiments to see how well the pivot point is replicated in other experiments.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a reasonable thing to do, and there certainly has been some work on that. And that, you know, simple hockey stick, which is a piecewise linear, is only one variety of hockey stick. Right. You can have curved hockey sticks where they actually are, you know, continuous, differentiable, and, you know, you don't have an actual pivot point, and so it, you know, becomes, you know, more feasible to estimate. Well, it's still a pivot point, but you know, where the curve stops and the linear portion begins, that'd be the pivot point, where it's no matter what the shape of the stick looks like.
Right.
So yes, I mean, you need to do some, simulations, there, and there has been some work done along those lines, and I think that's not a bad thing to do. And you can actually estimate an LC0 or EC0, with a hockey stick model, and I'm skeptical about how reliable that is as to having really estimating a 0% concentration level. But there are people that have spent a lifetime doing exactly that.
Have you done simulations on these methods that you mentioned? And
Yes, I have been doing that for quite a long time, and yes, that's I'm known for that in certain circles. So.
I think that's important myself.
Well, I agree.
I see that Gene has a question in the chat. Would you ever feel relevant prior information was available about parameters? And if so, would regulators accept the use of informative prior distributions?
Yes, Bayesian methods in general are increasingly utilized in risk assessment, and I think that's going to continue. And so, yes, I think there is prior information that certainly in some cases, not every case, that would be relevant. For example, I'm looking at doing a major study right now with the Crop Life Europe, and to what extent can we use historical control data in evaluating a given experiment? It helps you identify an unusual control that may really affect the results of your one study. And so using this prior information about the historical controls, I think, can be quite informative. You have to be a little bit careful, how much weight do you give to the historical data or to the, whatever database you're using, and how much to the concurrent experiment. But yes, I think that's quite relevant.
Okay, I think we will wrap it up for tonight. And this is outstanding, very interesting presentation for me. Want to thank our speaker, John Green. Again, terrific, well done. And I hope you'll be hearing from us fairly soon from the officers about elections and future programs. So keep those cards and letters coming, folks, and we'll see you around. Take care. Good night, everyone.
Very good.
Hal, before you get off, is there any election that has to happen? Didn't we kind of build in a little, flexibility for the beginning, or
I thought this was in the bylaws that it has to take place annually.
Okay.
Yeah, it is in the bylaws. Yes.
Yeah. I thought maybe, but so what has to change? The president?
Well, in theory, I think all the officers have to be elected. I mean, people can volunteer to continue, and I know we had.
So there isn't a term. I've forgotten the bylaws. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, the term is 1 year, and then people can say, okay, so and so has agreed to continue. If you're in favor, great. But in theory, everybody gets voted on again.
Okay.
I mean, every office gets voted on again.
I just say, because Larry was sort of treasurer forever, and I don't ever remember voting.
Well, there was a vote eons ago.
Maybe originally, yes. Okay. But not annually. Okay.
And, well, we didn't have elections, and then the local chapter kind of fell apart, and that's when.
Yeah. It's a good thing to have it. I just, it's another thing we got to pay attention to. So
yeah,
okay.
I think I mean, usually for about 20 years or more, we had the May meeting each year was the election meeting,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a standard slate. The old practice was that the president would exit, and the vice president would be the nominee for president. Anybody could nominate anybody else, but each officer moved up one rank, and so over time, everybody served in every position.
Yeah.
But then at some point we didn't.
Competition for the positions.
That's true. There wasn't usually a lot of competition.
One other thing we used to do is have these annual conferences.
Right.
With the real nice dinner on the night before with music, live music, and
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Those were the days, right?
yeah, right.
I attended one of the conferences and it was great. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we made money on the early ones, and then we lost money on several of the most recent ones.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So then how we're going to see something about some way to do elections then coming up, huh?
Right. And so I'll be writing to our current officers. We'll set up a meeting sometime in the next few weeks, and then inform the membership of what the procedure will be.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you, you know, this was a great talk, and now I'm kicking myself that I didn't invite the students. I never got it off. How I had asked, how could I invite? But I think even some of our resource economics or environmental students would have been interested.
Absolutely.
In, you know, it wasn't so technical that you wouldn't also appreciate the debate that goes on here. So thanks a lot, John. I think it was great.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes,
Good.
indeed.
Now we can say goodbye.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Yeah, thank
Good
you,
night.
John.
Good night.
Bye.
Good
Thank
night.
you. Night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you, John.